any sex worker knows how hard it is to get verified on these platforms. So first of all, it's just disingenuous, especially in 2022, to say, oh, there's tons of non-consensual content, even aside from the fact that, like, how could you tell, right? They look at kink.com and they think, oh, this must be, this is torture.
Hey, this is Melrose Michaels, and this season I am stoked to announce hosting On The Horizon with guest host Lotus Lane.
That's right. And here on the Horizon Podcast, just like with previous seasons, we are going to discuss what's on the horizon for sex workers and how to navigate it.
Each season, we set the stage for sex workers and sex work adjacent guests to share their experience and expertise on challenges facing sex workers as we discuss how we can overcome them and work towards progress as a collective.
Yes, and new episodes air on the 1st and 15th of each month, and we'd love to have you listen in and join us. You can find us on all of your favorite podcast platforms, so just search for On The Horizon, which is spelled WHORIZON, to tune in. Also, just a reminder, if you're enjoying the podcast on Apple, to please leave us a 5-star review. That really helps us grow on the podcast and better share the information with our guests on the sex work community as a whole.
This segment of today's episode is sponsored by Sex.com, one of the absolute best content creator platforms out there. It looks better than any other, has a higher level of security than any other, and boasts over 3 million unique visitors a day scrolling through viral looped adult short form videos. Sex.com is like, well, sex itself. A lot of people do it. Some just do it much, much better than the others. Sex.com. If you're gonna do it right. Hello, Mike Stabile, and welcome to On The Horizon Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
We wanted to bring you on to talk about kind of a lot of the propaganda and myths around NCOSI and Trafficking Hub, due to the fact that, our season 3 is all about myths and propaganda, and there's a lot of that going around in the industry. So I guess before we get started, could you just introduce yourself to the people who are just tuning in for the first time or just meeting you?
Sure. My name is Mike Stabile. I am the Director of Public Affairs at the Free Speech Coalition, which is the industry trade association and advocacy group. I also have been in the industry for probably 20 years at this point. I've written about the industry. I've worked on documentaries about the industry. But the work that we're doing now to sort of combat the misinformation around sex and sex trafficking is some of the most important work that I've been involved with.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess, Lotus, if you want to kick us off by maybe just kind of an overview, like, I guess, Trafficking Hub in general for people who don't know, because we hear that a lot, and I know some creators kind of like think of it as just like an off-slang word and not a full campaign. So I guess if you could just tell us a little bit about what Trafficking Hub is. Yeah,
Trafficking Hub is a campaign that was started against Pornhub. They even, took on their logo looking, colorways and everything to get people's attention to look at what they were talking about. And basically they were saying people were being trafficked on Pornhub and that there were videos of non-consensual exchanges on there. People that didn't want their videos up there had them against their will, and that Pornhub was refusing to take them down. So it was a very big, strategically organized campaign. And in my opinion, because it feels like it got very convoluted, I think it was started with NCOSI group and all of that. And then all of the other anti-porn, anti-sex work groups jumped on. But I know Mike is way more well-versed from top to bottom in the details. So break it down for us, please, Mike.
Well, it's funny. The Trafficking Hub, as Lotus mentioned, right, was really strategically against one particular site, Pornhub. And that was a strategic move, right? Because this was a very well-recognized brand. It was also a brand I think importantly, that had made inroads to be something that you could talk about on late night TV, or you could talk about it in a news article. It made porn, an acceptable point of conversation. And I think for the evangelical and other faith-based groups, this was something that always angered them, right? They didn't like the idea that people were talking about porn in a non-stigmatized way. They feel that porn is evil, that porn is always exploitation, that no one can consent to any type of sex work, that there's always force, fraud, or coercion. And so I think they strategically chose their target. If you look back at the origins of the Trafficking Hub campaign, what you see is that in February of 2020, right before we're going into the pandemic, a woman named Lila Micklethwait of a group called Exodus Cry, which is an anti-porn, anti-sex work. They call themselves abolitionists. Meaning they want to abolish all forms of sex work and pornography, offshoot of an evangelical church out of Kansas City. So this organization is formed, probably about 10 years earlier, but they sort of seize on this moment to say, we're going to take down Pornhub. And there is an op-ed in the Washington Examiner, which is a conservative publication, saying there are women, or more specifically, there are girls being trafficked on this site. There are countless girls. There's all this sort of stuff going on, and we need to do it. And I think that when it first starts happening, what you start seeing is it starts getting repeated a lot in the Christian press. Right. So if you're monitoring this sort of stuff, that's where the conversation has happened. It doesn't seem in that way any different than some of the other ones. Lotus brought up NCOSE, which is the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. They're a group that was formerly known as Morality in Media. Some of their highlights prior to the Trafficking Hub campaign were, getting Cosmo removed from Walmart checkout shelves. They regard Cosmo as pornography. They campaigned against same-sex benefits for Disney employees. Even this year, they were complaining about the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue. So this is a group that has very conservative, very prudish morals around sex and sexuality, especially in the public square. They don't believe that any sort of pornography should exist. They think that it's all illegal and it just isn't being prosecuted. So, this is a conversation, at least at first, is happening in very specific areas and doesn't seem all that different than what's gone on before, right? This is something that these are people that protested, outside art exhibits and are complaining about erotic novels on Amazon.
Yeah.
That's so wild, because when you talk about even their previous name, Morality in Media, it's interesting to see the shift where it was censoring things in checkout lines and kind of small fish, smaller campaigns that didn't have as far as a reach or as much of an impact on sex workers or the adult industry as something like Trafficking Hub. It seems like that is their creme de la creme campaign of attack.
Yeah, I see that too. I also kind of reminds me of the attacks here in LA from the AHF group. I was just making sure I said that correctly. Yeah. When they were saying that our industry was causing a rampant uptick in HIV and STIs out in the general public, and that's why we needed to be regulated and have condom use. But we knew that was all made up as well to fit their agenda. And it's really interesting how it's similarly run with this Trafficking Hub campaign. They knew Pornhub would be a big fish. It would get a lot of attention. So let's blame it all on them. And it's the same way that they blamed all the STIs on the porn industry in general with the AHF group. Interesting how these tactics are so similar.
Yeah,
I think that's a really great point. I think, I worked with Lotus on the Prop 60 campaign, which was a conservative bill from AIDS Healthcare Foundation, AHF, which was mandating condoms on porn stars. And they approached it much in the way that Trafficking Hub does, from the perspective of, we need to save these sex workers. They're being exploited.
Yeah.
And, And you have to ignore what they're saying if they come out in their own defense, because they're just being controlled, right? You can't trust what they're saying. And they're being paid off by big, I've been called big pimp, or like the big pimp lobby, or something like that.
But I found that to be very ironic, Mike, because and I know behind the scenes that both of those groups, AHF and the Cozy group, have paid former adult stars to make more compelling testimonials that would appeal to their audiences. I won't say the L word live, but I will say that they were coerced into saying more compelling testimonials.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a funny thing, because it's somebody pointing out to you, oh, you're accusing you of doing what they're actually doing, right? No one would possibly do this. They're like, we have to pay these people to say these things. We have to give them support. And so we're going to assume that you must be doing the same thing, but on a much larger and more nefarious scale. And it's a way of taking away sex workers' voices, right? If you can say in the media that they are being controlled. I mean, I remember going for Prop 60, we went up to Sacramento, and a legislator saying, I think to Lorelei Lee, how do I know you're not being paid?
Oh my God.
And and
she could ask him the same question.
Yeah.
And she did. She did. She would just like, you have a job. Like, yes, I have, I am, I am a worker in this industry, right? Like, I have things, like I am not being paid to do this specifically, but yes, I do earn revenue here, but you can't say that that takes away my ability to have an honest opinion in where this is. But it's a really great point. I think that like they share a whole lot. I mean, the other thing that was similar between AHF and the Prop 60 campaign and what we see with Trafficking Hub is it really is, sort of what's known as a media effects argument, right? That at the root of this, they're concerned about what viewing this content does, right? To them, to their relationships, to their children, to whatever it is. It's really not about the content itself. They want to make it about the content itself. With AHF, it was really about, they're shooting and they're not wearing condoms. They ignore the testing system. They ignore the actual stats in terms of its effectiveness in preventing things. They ignore what the complaints that performers were having around condoms and why they didn't find them effective on a 3-hour shoot or found it more dangerous. Because what they were saying was this sets a bad example. And when you go into, I think that the Trafficking Hub, one of the things that it did that was smart was it tried to distance itself, right? It didn't come out as a traditional morality campaign. And in fact, Morality in Media, changed its name to Nicosi to sound a little bit more generic, right? It was losing that battle. Pornhub had and other adult sites and sex workers had been so long at saying like, this is not big. This isn't stigmatized. We should be talking about this like any other industry. That they had to shift tactics. And so what they did instead was, we're going to talk about this in very generic terms. Women are being hurt. But when you go into it deeper and you look at some of the older conversations, right, the stuff before they redo their brand, and whether that's Exodus Cry or Nicosi, what you see are, deeper conversations about like, well, when men watch this content, they get ideas. And then they come home to their wives and want their wives to do it. And when their wives won't do it, they rape them. Or alternately that women watch this content and then they become promiscuous. Or in particular, in some of the alt-right groups, then they want to have sex with black men. It's like this very weird, explicit thing, and where we're going to weaken the family, we're going to weaken the white race. Like there are all of these sort of weird conservative ideals that are swimming around in the same ecosystem around this Trafficking Hub campaign.
It's wild to think, because obviously Trafficking Hub is they feel like they've won this campaign too, because was it recently this past week, there was a polling from the demonetization, like fully.
I think what I saw was that Visa was not even allowing the ads company to monetize ads on the site.
Yeah.
So they've already demonetized us being able to get Visa, MasterCard revenue from our customers and fans. But yeah, even ads can't.
Yeah, now monetize. So they feel that they're winning this war. Do you think, personally, Mike, and this is obviously an opinion-based question, but do you think that this, as a win for them, will have other impacts across other platforms and sites?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is, I don't know that I would, in absolute terms, characterize the recent decision by Visa and MasterCard to pull ad processing as that much of a win. I really have doubts that most of the people that were, if Heinz or, whoever is advertising on Pornhub, they're probably not doing it with a credit card. Like it was sort of a fake out. But this is a tremendous fundraising source for them, right? When they have these victories or when they file these court cases, immediately you get, I'm on all their mailing lists. You then get out, we've had this huge victory, you have to do it. And if they have a loss, they say, oh, big porn has taken us on, we're being crushed, we need more money. So in some ways, it's a lot like, a certain former president's political campaign, right? Like you're constantly persecuted. And if you win, you have to fundraise off. If you lose, you have to fundraise off of it. But I think that what they have been effective at doing is changing that conversation and portraying Pornhub and the industry in general as a center for trafficking, right? That this is something that is widespread. That I mean, when I watched, there was a CNBC interview that happened 2 weeks ago with Lila Micklethwait and Bill Ackman, who is a hedge fund investor, a billionaire who really has a lot of pull with Visa and MasterCard. And Lila was on Squawk Box, which is an MSNBC or a CNBC show, and she said, I went on the platform this afternoon, right before the show. And within minutes, I was able to pull up dozens of non-consensual content, illegal content, people who shouldn't be there. These people need to verify.
How did she know that there was no consent in the videos?
Yeah. Or that they're not verified.
How did she know those people shouldn't be there? Based upon, and that's one thing that I don't like about this campaign, because they look at people on surface value and they say, oh, she's too young. This is obviously a trafficked person. Or, oh, this person has like a distressed look in their face in the video. This is obvious trafficking. When that doesn't account for all of the different acting that goes into adult porn making, there is a fair amount of acting involved in some scenarios, especially if it's kink, BDSM, fetish, whatever, hardcore, you're going to have distressed looks. That's part of the act, and some people cannot help that they look young. And that's been, thrown against us, as if people have to have a certain look to be adults or something like that.
Yes. That's like a really good segue, because obviously right now the new propaganda coming out of the same groups is this, like, if they look underage, it should be illegal or it should not exist.
Should be reported.
So can you speak a little bit to that, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in some ways it's a natural outgrowth of this old campaign. So what you see with, when Lila Micklethwait says she goes on to the site and she can find, illegal content, Lotus is right? You can't tell anything from a video. And particularly, they look at it and they assume, because they believe that nobody can consent, they actually can sort of say like, oh, this must not be consensual. Pornhub, for, the past 2 years, and in some cases even beyond, verifies absolutely everybody who's on that platform, right? You have to go through an extensive creator profile. You have to do biometrics. You have to submit your ID. You have to have that ID validated by a third party that specializes in validating IDs. You have to move your head this way and move your head that way to make sure it's not a fake and a picture and that it's current and that you're live and that it matches it. You have to submit consent forms, right? And if there people are in your videos, you have to submit consent forms. Any sex worker knows how hard it is to get verified on these platforms. So first of all, it's just disingenuous, especially in 2022, to say, oh, there's tons of non-consensual content, even aside from the fact that, like, how could you tell, right? They look at kink.com and they think, oh, this must be, this is torture. And the same with, they've sort of teased their latest campaign, which is going to be, about people who look too young, right? So it's no longer, originally it was, we have people on here who are too young, and Pornhub's doing nothing about it, which was a lie to begin with. Pornhub has been an aggressive moderator, much more so than any other social media company. We live in a world at this point of user-generated content, and if you want to go over iMessage or Snapchat or Dropbox or whatever, you're always going to have incidents, right? There's always going to be people who are sexting each other underage or sharing material, or if you look at where they're doing sort of like when they talk about like underage web cams or things like that, that's coming through Skype. That's coming through, that's not coming through porn companies. That's coming, which have moderation.
Back to my earlier point that I was making, like, this is more salacious. This is getting more headlines to go trafficking hub to Pornhub rather than make it like trafficking Skype or trafficking Facebook. Like, that's where moms and grandmas are. We don't want to attack Facebook. We want to attack where the sluts are, where the supposed pimps and, degraded people are. And that's what I think is so hypocritical about this whole campaign, because if they really wanted to help people that are trafficking victims, they aren't so much being exploited on porn websites. They're being exploited on regular apps that people use every day.
Yeah, 100%.
Absolutely. And, I think that this is sort of gets to their motivation, right? Because the motivation is not so much about, it's not so much about stopping illegal content, right? Because as Lotus points out, that illegal content mostly lives on illegal websites, right? Yeah. It lives on like weird things that change their IP and their addresses. Like they're operating out of places like Russia and India and Amsterdam that don't clamp down, right? That don't shut these things down. A site that is operating out of the US and Canada, if there was actually trafficking going on the site would shut, the government could shut that down in a second. Like it's already illegal. There's not anything that's happening on there that is, that knowingly dealing with any of this. And I think that when you see their latest campaign, which they're teasing, which is saying, we're going to go after, what's called barely legal content, right? Content that is, someone is 18 years old and, but they've got pigtails on and they think they look young, or they're 24 years old. I mean, there's a famous, a sort of infamous case with one of the anti-porn activists posting on her Twitter account, Pornhub has somebody clearly underage. And, here's an underage person on there showing a picture, people quickly being like, oh no, that's so-and-so, she's 24. You don't like, there's a lot of stuff from the surface that they think that they're doing. But this goes back to, when you look at the Exodus Cry campaign that's coming out, what they say is, well, this is fueling child abuse, right? They don't give any details. They don't give, and they certainly don't compare it to sexual repression and how that fuels child abuse, right? There's nobody saying that, like, not talking about sex to your kids and not giving them an opportunity to report it and dealing with, the Department of Justice just announced it's, investigating the Southern Baptists, for trafficking. So it's never about that. What they want is they want to remove sex from the public square. Yeah. And so what they do is they go after the stuff that seems the most controversial. And that historically, right, obviously that's going to be child pornography. We're all against child pornography and CSAM, child sexual abuse material, which is the sort of newer term for it. We're all against illegal content. We're all against non-consensual content and revenge porn. And you're not going to find any argument in the porn industry that we should permit this or that we want to encourage it, right? It's a scourge that we try to get off the site so that people do. But what they want is they want sex out of the public square. So they want to go after Pornhub. It's easy to go after Pornhub. They want to do the same thing now to Twitter and Reddit, right? And say, okay, Twitter and Reddit need to keep all of this material as well, because it's going to be shared on their sites. What are Twitter and Reddit going to do? They're going to say, well, we don't have the capacity to do this. We don't have a whole 2257 department. We don't want to be accidentally liable because Pornhub does all that and they still get pressured, and cut off. So they could say, well, we're going to just block things, right? So what they want is they want to slowly remove sex from the public square. And so they go after things like, this sort of phantom idea of like child sex abuse material on Pornhub, or they go after, stuff that looks like that they think that the person looks too young, slowly sort of move the needle. It will be, if you look at historically, it is BDSM. It is interracial content. It's queer content, right? You go after the stuff that has the fewest defenders, right? Or the fewest people who are going to stand up for it. And, eventually get to a point where you can cut off the sort of generic vanilla, like, content. But, like, they feel that, that MILF content is, or stepmom is incest. And so that is illegal and coerced, right? Because you can't consent to incest. So they have all these sort of like definitions that they sort of play with to try to say, there's illegal content here, or this content is obscene, or this content is, beyond, I think more importantly, the terms of service in Visa and MasterCard. And that's where they have focused it.
Yeah. I feel like that's the only lane they could have been semi-effective in, because like you said, if all of these things were happening on a platform as large as something like Pornhub, the government could come into play. Like, that already exists. There's a plug they could pull on a platform like this. So because that's not going to work, they've had to do all of these other things. It's just crazy how it's gotten away with the media. Like, I feel like it's really been kind of a trial by media, and that's where things landed.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the president of Nicosia is a guy named Patrick Truman. In the 80s and early 90s, he was the head of the arm of the Justice Department that was charged with arresting and bringing down pornographers, right? So they took down, I would say, half of the major companies in the U.S., during that time, right? Not for actual violations, right? Because at that point it was obscenity. So you would bring someone in, you think this material is obscene. Again, that tended to be queer content, BDSM, interracial. That was like the stuff that they would go after, because you could order a videotape at that point to Alabama or Utah, to a small town, and it was judged on community standards. And you said, oh, this was used the U.S. mail. You did this. You're going down. Mostly it wasn't victories that they got, in terms of court victories, but what they were able to get were settlements, right? So people would say, okay, I'm going to settle this case for, $250,000 or $500,000 or whatever, or I'm going to go out of business because I can't deal with this. So they would do this. And then what they found was that you could get people, even if you couldn't get a victory, what you would do is you could get sort of like death by 1,000 cuts. And I think that when they look at it now, right, you can't do that anymore, because the old standard, which was really based on whatever town the videotape was sold in, that was where you were judged, right? And so they would order these things. The FBI would order something to a small town in Utah, and people would say, oh, it's gay sex. That's outside our community standards. That's obscene. Yeah. Now with the internet, you don't have that standard. The internet is the entire internet, and they can't do that. So what they've done is to say, well, we can't use the government anymore to go after these people, but these corporations, Visa and MasterCard, are really brand aware, right? They're really brand sensitive. Mm. They are mainstream mom and pop brand. Yeah. They don't want any association with this. They are giant global corporations. They don't want any controversy. So if we can link them to this, even though the facts aren't there, right? Even though if we can run a media campaign against them, we can get them to drop these companies just because it's easier, right? And that's what we see with obviously all financial services with sex and sex work. If you can make allegations of trafficking, if you can say, oh, these people can't consent, or these people have been, these people are nefarious, we will, they know that the companies will just sort of say, okay, well, we'll get them off because we don't want to be in charge. We don't want to accidentally do something illegal. And so we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're going to get rid of everything on here just so that we don't have any problems.
Yeah. It's so exhausting. It feels like it's an uphill battle. And then and I've had this conversation even privately with you, Mike, where I'm like, some days it just feels like we're losing. some days are really, really tough. And then we've also spoken too, because we're like, I go back and forth with like, okay, it feels like we're losing today and it's really heavy. And then I'm like, well, what's this going to look like? Like, what could the potential outcome of this be if it doesn't go our way? And I know I've told you this, but I was like, I don't know in terms of like financial security, because like obviously all my info or income comes from sex work in one shape or another, depending which company. They're all aligned with sex work. So like I feel financially insecure in that way, even though I thought I was diversified. It's a sex worker clothing line, it's a sex worker educational company, but it also do with sex work. So like I know I've spoken to you where I'm like, I don't know what the future of this industry could look like if it doesn't go our way. And we kind of spoke that we thought maybe it will actually be of benefit, because maybe more things end up behind paywalls and maybe more creators could potentially be getting paid instead of having something like a Pornhub where it can be gone and viewed for free. Maybe that raises our prices back up on something like an OnlyFans, etc. But I don't know.
I wouldn't mind that being a positive outcome of everything. You know, if we're banned from so much public exposure that everything is behind a paywall again, I mean, hey.
Yeah. I mean, that's the best case scenario. I feel like that's what we could hope for.
Yeah.
The issue, I mean, I think that there are a couple of things. I mean, one, it's always important to realize that this is a reactionary movement, right? This is, and certainly like the rise of the conservative right as well as a reactionary movement. It doesn't mean that reactionary movements aren't victorious, right? Or that they can't have victories, but they are a reaction to the progress that we're making, right? They are the reason that they go after companies like Pornhub and OnlyFans, where they make similar accusations that are similarly baseless, is because those are in the public eye. And like, you know, if you talk to people in their 20s, they're going to say porn's fine. Yeah. Like, you know, for the most part, they're like, it's no big deal. Like, why are you people freaking out about this? Yeah. You know, it is something where like they're freaking out because they're losing. And you know, in the grand scheme of things, obviously, there is an outcome where, you know, if things were to go behind paywalls, it, you know, potentially, and you know, perhaps it would stop piracy. I think that what you're probably going to see is that stuff is actually going to show up on sites that can't be regulated. You know, for the most part, you would hope that things would not go to paywalls, but what you're going to see is sort of proliferation of things that are on illegal sites rather than sites that actually do moderate and do respond to DMCA notices, right? If you've got copyright and things like that. You also potentially lose all of Twitter and, you know, like if Twitter becomes like Instagram and, you know, or Reddit takes off those adult content, you maybe lose access to a market. Maybe not. I mean, I think there's always a way to look for, I mean, it's just my natural way is to be like, what's the silver lining? What can I pull out of this that is valuable? And I think that like, from a business perspective, that's always what sex workers look for. It's like, yes, this is bad. How can I thrive in this? We are, you know, I mean, as an industry, we are an industry that knows how to thrive in, or survive at least, in adverse circumstances, because that's all that we're given. Doesn't mean it's a good thing, but, you know, yes, it will survive. But hopefully, I think that if you look at this historically as well, this current moment where there is the evangelicals and the rise of sort of a anti-porn feminist left as well, are limited in time, right? So they happen at specific times, often when society is changing, or things like, I think that's linked to, a lot of this is linked to sort of debates around gender and sexuality and trans identity and things like that. You know, it happened in the 80s, it happened in the 70s, it happened, you know, in the early 90s. And in some ways, it's a little bit of a fever, you know, that has to burn itself out. You know, I think that, you know, and I hope that the industry comes together a little bit more and understands the difference with this. I think one of the things that allowed this campaign to grow the way that it did was because in the early days, a lot of performers who didn't have a great relationship with Pornhub, right? They maybe saw their content up there, you know, and thought it was costing them money, and maybe it was, you know, they joined on the campaign. Yeah, we hate this. Or you read a headline that says Pornhub is filled with child sex abuse material. And you don't know any better than reading that, right? You may not know. I mean, just like with the mainstream media, they don't know all the moderation that goes on, right? They don't know how this works. All they get is what is being put out by evangelical groups trying to shut the company down. So they don't actually, it's a much easier headline to say Pornhub is filled with illegal content than it is to say, no, actually, like, you know, in a user-generated content world, there's always going to be exceptions where things break through and mistakes are made. But we moderate this, this, and this. We take content down as soon as we're alerted. We have no interest in having this content up there. You know, it is, it's a much harder argument, but I am convinced that, like, we can do it. I mean, if you look back at what happened with OnlyFans in, you know, last summer, right around this time, the right wing was going after OnlyFans as well. They had put a order into, they'd been sent a letter to the Department of Justice saying, you know, there's full of trafficking, there's full of all of these things. It was basically written by some of these right wing evangelical groups, anti-porn groups. You know, and the banks got nervous. They said, we're reading these headlines. We're going to pull out of this. And what happened then was that sex workers fought back, and they said, absolutely not. This is what we do. This is how we do this verification. We're the people that you should be listening to. Yeah. And the banks calmed down. So I think that we have to always remember that the plus side is that sex workers have the power here, right? Not all the power, and not like the big power that these individuals group, but they're not without power and actually can really affect change from the ground up.
Yeah, especially while we still have some of these platforms.
When these companies do listen to us, that is true, because everything you just said, it just comes down to they need to listen to the performers. They need to listen to sex workers. Whether it was Pornhub, when we were asking them to do these moderation things a lot stronger before Visa and MasterCard came along, or if it's Visa and MasterCard saying all these things based on what they see in articles, and we're literally telling them that's not how it is. This is the way we actually operate in a legal way. And yeah, it all boils down to we are the ones doing the work. Listen to us.
Yeah.
Don't speak 100%. Over us. Don't speak for us.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a great place to end. Mike, for the people listening, where can they find more of you?
I am on Twitter at Mike Stabile, MikeStabile, and we're at FSC Army. Which is the, you should also follow that. That is the Free Speech Coalition main Twitter account, and freespeechcoalition.com.
Yeah.
Yes. And Free Speech Coalition just launched an OnlyFans. So if you want to support them, you should sub their OnlyFans page.
Yes. It makes it easier to donate than trying to find a donation link on a web page. You know, we all have OnlyFans nowadays, so just tap that follow, drop a couple $5, $10 tips here and there, and we would definitely appreciate it at Free Speech Coalition.
100%. Love that. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, guys. Good talking with you.
Who misses free and affordable ads without the anti-sex work rhetoric? Assembly 4 is a team of sex workers and technologists from Melbourne, Australia, aiming to bring back free and fair advertising to the sex work community. They also give back to organizations based in harm reduction, sex work, and education, stepping away from the clunky design of traditional platforms. Their platform, tris.link, is a refreshing and well-needed change in both presentation and mission. It's free to join and open to all. In the words of an A4 user, from the policies to the language to the advice and tips, it makes such a big difference to feel supported and encouraged instead of policed.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of On the Horizon, a podcast about what's on the horizon for sex workers and how to navigate it.
I'm Melrose Michaels, and you can find me at Melrose Michaels on social and melrosemichaels.com.
And I'm Lotus Lane, and you can find me on all social media at It's Lotus Lane, which is spelled ITSLOTUSLAIN.